Africa is not poor. Africa is rich in natural resources. It is home to some of the world's largest deposits of minerals that are worth billions of US dollars annually. The continent represents 20% of the Earth's surface, which makes Africa the second largest and the second most populous continent in the world.
Africa is strategically located between the Atlantic Ocean. We have one of the best species of wild animals in the world. Africa has good flora and fauna. Africa has good water mass body. Africa used to have all and is still having all it takes to be economically viable.
Africa is not poor. End of the day, we are sitting on a huge wealth. This is not contested by whoever.
Despite having it all, Africa is still lagging behind in terms of economic development. Some experts argue that much of the continent's wealth is being extracted and exploited mainly by countries and entities outside the continent.
The reality is that our wealth has been stolen for more than a century because we had no plan for our wealth as defined by today's standards. And Western people had a plan for it. And up to now, Africa has not defined properly its own plan for its resources. That's exactly why we are members of International Monetary Fund. We are members of World Bank, and they define the rules.
Africa was impoverished deliberately. And most of the time, this west of Africa was stolen by our leaders, encouraged by Europe and America. And they are using this for businesses. A lot of African assets have been seized, and most of them are not returned back to the parent country. And if you check all the other markets, we have given up our economic sovereignty, and we have been invaded by outsiders who now control the narrative. And that is why we are always poor.
According to the United Nations Environment Programme, about 30% of the world's mineral reserves are in Africa, including gold, which accounts for 40% of the world's output. The continent also accounts for 8% of the world's natural gas and 12% of global oil reserves. Now, these natural resources present a huge potential for Africa and its people.
The quantity and the quality of wealth that has been looted cannot be known until somebody doing the figures, and these figures will be coming from Western world, and they don't want to give it these figures because this started with very informal business.
Experts observe that despite the huge wealth, many African countries are struggling to attain economic growth and development, with living standards and conditions for their citizens remaining generally low.
Imagine Nigeria, for example, a big producer of crude oil, does not even have a refinery in its own country, importing refined products. It's a very, very pitiable situation in the Francophone countries, because France has refused to let Francophone countries in Africa breathe. Most of the countries in Africa are now dumping grounds for European goods, for American goods, and for Chinese and Indian goods.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is Africa's second largest country and the 11th largest globally by land area. It has some of the world's richest deposits of diamonds, gold, copper, cobalt, tin, tantalum, and lithium, worth about $24 trillion, according to the International Trade Administration. Yet many people in the DRC still grapple with extreme poverty. In 2022, about 62% of Congolese, which is around 60 million people, lived on less than $2.15 a day, according to the World Bank. The scramble for DRC's vital minerals by foreign companies is believed to be fueling armed conflicts, with government troops struggling to tackle militias for decades.
In Congo, we have oil resources, and on these oil resources, we don't even know how much we are really exporting because we do not have count the quantities on the platform, and it has been so for so many years. The only way to be able to give these resources to African and especially to Congo is to start producing resources locally to be able to start marketing them from Congo. As you may know, diamond is exported to Belgium, and today all the coal and copper is going to China. And when you look at that, There is no fair deal. Everything is made on a jungle rule. The strongest set up the rules and then make it work, and the strongest today is one who has cash.
According to Pope Francis, the plundering of Africa's resources by world's powerful nations is choking Africa. He strongly criticized them during his visit to the DRC in January 2023.
Il veleno dell'avidità ha reso I suoi diamanti insanguinati. È un dramma davanti al quale il mondo economicamente più progredito chiude spesso gli occhi, le orecchie e la bocca. Ma questo paese e questo continente meritano di essere rispettati e ascoltati, meritano spazio e attenzione. Giù le mani della Repubblica Democratica della Congo, giù le mani dell'Africa.
While foreign mining companies exploit Africa's resources, there are also concerns about environmental degradation and the treatment of African workers, including children, with rights groups calling for accountability. The president of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, believes it is time to reconfigure the relationship between African countries and the world powers sucking up the continent's vast resources.
C'est dans cette optique que nous encourageons et exigeons des partenariats mutuellement avantageux dans l'exploitation de nos richesses afin qu'ils concourent à l'accroissement des possibilités d'emploi ainsi qu'à l'amélioration des conditions de vie de nos populations.
The exploitation of Africa by Western countries dates back to the period of colonialism and slavery. But what worries many is how it continues decades after African countries gained political independence. At the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2023, Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo reminded Western countries of their atrocities in Africa and demanded reparations.
It is time to acknowledge openly that much of Europe and the United States have been built from the vast wealth harvested from the sweat, tears, blood, and horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the centuries of colonial exploitation. Maybe we should also admit that it cannot be easy to build confident and prosperous societies from nations that for centuries have their natural resources looted and their peoples traded as commodities. For centuries, the world has been unwilling and unable to confront the realities of the consequences of the slave trade. But gradually, this is changing, and it is time to bring the subject of reparations firmly to the fore.
Illegal transactions and corruption also cost African countries a lot. According to the UN, annually, Africa loses about $195 billion of its natural capital through illicit financial flows, illegal logging, illegal trade in wildlife, and unregulated fishing. The illicit financial flows include tax avoidance and evasion, falsification of trade invoices, and other criminal activities. Some African leaders have also been criticized for corruption and mismanagement of funds.
Europe encourages this illicit flow from Africa because they use the money for business and they don't pay interest on it. So Africans' wealth keep on flowing out, and they tell them bring this. They save it in what they call the tax havens, and the countries lose.
Over the years, Western countries and multilateral institutions often say they provide some African countries with economic aid because of the perceived poverty in the continent. But many analysts say the so-called aid is a smokescreen.
What happens in the aid? A man comes, loots your economic viable resources, he takes it home, he impoverishes you. From what he has stolen from your land, he gives you a little. I said, I'm helping you, you are poor. Those economic aids are tied to some conditions, and most of the conditions are not favorable to African countries.
Africa faces increased pressure to capitalize on its own natural resources for growth. Analysts say with the right approach and policies, the continent can achieve economic development.
Africa must be able to understand that. Some African researchers have proven that the only way to do things is to make sure that these European countries, these American countries, China, invest in Africa and get the benefit of the investment by creating jobs and making sure that we all transform the most we can on the continent and in the countries.
there is hope for Africa. Africa needs to unite. Africa needs to break down its economic and physical boundaries. Africa needs to start uniting the use of their currency and start having one voice